for investors, this was just an era where the types of companies that were pulling in money were companies that were promising to take over an industry.
Right.
This was not a moment where people were looking for nicely profitable businesses. They were looking for the next Google, the next Airbnb, the next Uber, these companies that had the ambitions to try to do that. And WeWork was as close as anyone had gotten to attempting to do that to real estate,
Right.
which is of course a huge industry that had been relatively resistant to
Any change.
Sort of
Yeah,
any kind of change. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think, people were willing to look past a lot.
My guest today is Reeves Wiedeman. At its height, WeWork was valued at $47 billion, only to see that valuation disappear as investors got to look at how the company was run when they filed for an IPO. Reeves dives deep into WeWork and its CEO's astronomical rise from the marijuana and tequila-filled boardrooms to cult-like company summer camps. His book, Billion Dollar Loser, The Epic Rise and Spectacular Fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork, is a Wall Street Journal bestseller. I recently sat down with Reeves and we talked about Adam Neumann, WeWork, and his billion-dollar enablers, and what lessons, if any, were learned. Okay, Reeves, I'm so excited that you're on the show. And first off, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it. And I really consumed your book this weekend. The name of the book is Billion Dollar Loser, The Epic Rise and Spectacular Fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork. Reeves, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Charles, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Oh, I'm telling you, man, it just read like a train wreck. You know where it was going, and you just were just watching, and you say, it can't get worse, it can't get worse, and like, oh my gosh. Like I was reading some of it on the train this morning, and it's just funny, I was reading on the train. It really is cringeworthy at points.
Yeah, and I think we obviously... most of the people reading this book know the ending or more or less the details of the ending. And I think it is hard. And I hope what's useful about the book is trying to be able to understand what happened at the time, because, the people who are on the train did not think they were heading for a crash. I mean, many of them worried about it and worried that things could go off the rails, to really draw out the analogy. But by and large, they thought like, we are a very fast moving train, but we are going some pretty amazing places. And so trying to figure out, in many ways, this was something that happened all of a sudden and shockingly quickly, things fell apart. But the seeds of that were sort of planted for many years.
Right. Right. So let's start from the beginning. If I had no idea who Adam Neumann was or is, how would you describe Adam Neumann to someone who never met him, didn't know anything about this story?
I think one of the big things about Adam Neumann is he wanted to make it big. I mean, and that's not a totally unusual story. There's lots of people, especially people who moved to New York City in their 20s, as Adam Neumann did. But he had great ambitions from the beginning and didn't know exactly what he wanted, other than he wanted to get rich, he wanted to make a name for himself, and wanted to leave a mark. And in many ways, he did all that, even if it wasn't exactly the path that he followed. But I think that part of him is what drove him in a lot of ways. And it wasn't just all about money. I mean, he did want to get rich, but I think a lot of the things that drove WeWork in certain directions were about these kind of other ambitions that Adam had of kind of wanting to mold his company and eventually the world through his sort of lens. And he was the kind of person, as many people have said, who was charismatic enough and kind of crazy enough to at least make people think that he might be able to pull that off.
Right. So let's start from the beginning. We have this guy. He's what, 6'4", 6'5"? How tall is he? He's a pretty tall guy.
6'4", yeah, 6'5",
6'4", right? Depending on
shoes,
how much hair he has on. So
yeah.
Here's a guy who is an Israeli, who was brought up on a kibbutz, which is nothing more than a socialist commune. And he comes to the United States and he has all these big dreams, enrolls in Baruch College, goes there. Pick up the story from there.
Yeah, so that's when Adam got to New York, and he had followed his sister, who was a very successful supermodel. I mean, she was on the cover of magazines all over Europe, and she was kind of living this fancy life in New York City. She was actually a few years younger than Adam, but he had gotten there. He was a little older than the traditional college student because he had spent a few years in the Israeli Navy. So he enrolled kind of as a freshman in his early 20s in New York, and very quickly in college he started a couple of businesses. And you can look back at them and kind of laugh at them now, but these are the kinds of businesses that many entrepreneurs sort of start in their early days. He tried to make a collapsible women's heeled shoe for his sister to be able to walk around New York City and then pop out a heel whenever she needed to. That didn't work. And then he started a baby clothes company. And the sort of now laughable aspect of his particular take on baby clothes was that he thought they should have knee pads because he at the time was a childless single man in his 20s, but he was certain that babies' knees must hurt when they crawl across the floor, even if they can't tell you that. So he was a serial sort of entrepreneur from the very, very beginning, and kind of one of those classic kind of business school types who classwork was not his thing, and he just wanted to start a business, and you take a look at those things that. And eventually getting into then the real estate business, it didn't really matter to Adam kind of early on what it was. He just wanted to start a business so he could become kind of a player in New York City and make some money and make a name for himself.
Okay, so one of his first business, which nothing can be held against him. Entrepreneurs always do that. You keep trying and you keep trying, and they look stupid when they fold, but they're not stupid if they make money. And there's a very thin line, between both. So they look silly now because they weren't successful. But if they were successful, everyone's, oh yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. So
yeah, and I think you can draw that out for WeWork in a lot of ways, and any business and any business that is trying to do something different. It is tricky to tell whether you're doing something different that might pay off, or doing something different that other people have decided not to do,
right,
for very good reasons.
Right. So he borrows, which just amazes me in the beginning. For when I read these kinds of stories, starting my own business when I was 22 years old, a money management firm, the biggest thing you always need for any new business is capital. And raising money from outside sources, family and friends, which is not your own money, it's still family and friends, is always the toughest, because they'll give you, but you always feel bad, like, wow, if they lose their money, I'm gonna have to see them at Thanksgiving. So Adam borrows $100,000, which is a pretty big amount of money, pretty big sum, from his grandmother to start the business that with the knee pads for kids, for toddlers, right? So he's able to sell anybody, anything, anytime. He is a fantastic, fantastic salesman.
Yeah, that's one of his great skills. But early on, he was getting support from family and friends. And it wasn't just his grandmother. Eventually, his wife put some money into his business. One of his sister's ex-boyfriends was someone he approached. He was very good. And yes, of course, I think we all know like the dangers of taking money from your family, but that's also how a lot of businesses get off the ground is family or friends of friends of friends that you have some kind of connection to. And Adam, sort of early on in his life in New York, took advantage of that and made a really concerted effort to try to find people who would invest in his ideas. And he did have a leg up in some ways. He did not arrive in New York the way some people do, especially people coming from other countries where you don't have a ton of connections. His sister was a supermodel. She was getting invited to parties all the time. Adam was sort of instantly kind of in his circle, and eventually in his wife's circle as well, which helped a lot with raising money early on.
Right. His wife is Gwyneth Paltrow's cousin, so that gave him access there. So he comes to New York, starts a couple of businesses, has access to capital, has access to connections. What makes him go into the real estate business? What makes him go into this thing of taking office space, chopping, taking like a pizza pie and slicing it up into so many little pieces where the sum is greater than the whole entire pie? In other words, the ability to make money from each individual square foot greater than what they're paying for the lease. How does that all take place?
Yeah, I think, Adam had always had this kind of amateur interest in real estate. I think, when you think about moving to New York and if you want to make it big, there's a few industries that you might try to make your name in, and real estate is one of them. And real estate is one that, in particular, takes a lot of risk and requires a lot of the things that Adam Neumann had. One, that ability and willingness to take those kind of ambitious leaps. He's charismatic. The real estate is not a world with quiet people sitting in the corner. This is a world of big personalities. And so I think when you looked at kind of the possible businesses he could have gotten into, I think it made a certain amount of sense. But in terms of the actual idea, he got it from someone else. And this was not the idea he had was not revolutionary at its most basic level. He had run into a friend of one of his college classmates, actually a relative of a college classmate, who was running a business like this in Manhattan. Rent out a space, cut it up into smaller offices, sell it out, have a kind of communal coffee area, run a softball team for all these little businesses that are all working together and don't have enough employees to have their own summer softball team. All the things that WeWork was kind of eventually about existed before. And I don't mean to take away a lot of credit, because I think there is a lot that WeWork did that was pretty remarkable once the idea really got going. But the actual kernel of it was something that existed before. And Adam, as his baby clothes business was sort of still struggling, sort of saw this as maybe something that connected more with his actual interests than baby clothes, and had a higher ceiling for what he might be able to build.
So he gets his first space, and the landlord is so enamored by this guy that he not only wants to be part of this, he wants to invest alongside of him, right?
Yeah, they sort of create this business together, and it was the landlord was essentially saying, "Here, I'll give you the space, and we'll whatever revenue we'll bring in, we'll split." And so, Adam needed a space, and he needed someone to take a risk on him. And the landlord was, kind of had this empty building in Dumbo at the time, which was not a hot neighborhood in New York City yet. And he wasn't instantly sure about the idea, but eventually it was kind of enough of a good enough gamble for him to take, to be willing to take a little bit of risk. And it worked. The landlord was so happy that they ended up kind of taking over more floors and eventually an entire building in Dumbo.
Right, and keep in mind, I want our listeners to keep in mind, this was right after 2008, the financial crisis. So there was a lot of office space, especially in New York City, that was vacant. A lot of companies going out, a lot of companies downsizing. So when a landlord has empty space, that's empty revenue. You're not collecting money from leases. So if you lease it out for theoretically $1, you're still making $1 more than you had. So the leap that the landlord took wasn't such a great one. It was really calculated, but Adam was on the hook for paying that, him and his partner, which he'll tell us in a second, they were on the hook for that whole lease.
Yeah, that's eventually kind of what happened, and that's the big risk of this business model.
Right.
Is
right.
And if you can make it work, you can make a lot of money, but you are taking on a good amount of risk. And when recessions have come in the past, this particular business model has been hit, as people were constantly kind of saying as WeWork grew, and as we saw over the past year is something that was very real.
Right. So before we get into the whole WeWorks and how it just exploded into something amazing, where at one point it had a value in the $47 billion. for a pretty mundane business, and no one could figure out how they were making money or how they would continue to make money. I just want to put this in perspective. You're really taking long-term leases at its core, because I remember when WeWorks was starting to come out, I had some experience with that because for years I was renting in the summer space from Regus. And that was basically the same concept. They rented the whole floor and they gave you an office and coffee, common areas were free. And by the way, as an entrepreneur and starting several businesses, they serve a really great function because all those sunk costs that you have when you open up your own office of furniture and deposits for electricity, for Con Ed and build out and coffee machines. Here, you're just paying, it's a la carte. You're paying a monthly fee. You're not sucked into a long-term lease. And you're pretty cool on that. So I definitely saw the need. What WeWorks was doing, and I thought was really amazing, is they were making it really hip. And they were making it a verb, right? You know, it was like a Google, right? So office space was considered, you know, this kind of subleasing was considered, you know, WeWork. But the point is, and I just want to put a fine point on this because it sounds really simple, a real simple business. But here's what happens. You sign a 10-year lease at X rate, and you're renting out short-term at Y rate. So regardless of what happens to your short-term tenants, they move in, they move out, the price goes up, the price goes, it doesn't matter. The landlord still has to be paid on a 10-year basis. You're locked into that lease, and that's your risk. So while everything's working great, you look like a genius. One little hiccup in the economy where people are not leasing enough space to cover your lease cost, you're on the hook. Is that more or less right?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. And you know, WeWork took some precautions to kind of try to protect themselves against this. They had a kind of unusual structure, which a lot of landlords couldn't believe that people were willing to go along with, where they, you know, they would only guarantee the sort of each individual building was only guaranteed at a certain amount. It wasn't guaranteed against the whole company's against the whole company. And so so they did take some precautions to not totally be on the hook for things, but in a lot of ways, yeah, that was the risk, and they knew it, and I think they believed, you know, I know they believed that you know, in a recession, their business would take a hit, they would have to adjust, but they were at least confident enough that they could try to pull it off.
Right. Okay. So Adam comes into this game and he opens up 2 or 3 of them. The original partner, I believe, who the landlord, Joel Schreiber, gives him, Adam comes up with a ridiculous valuation of, I think it was $45 million or so. And he goes, here, I want a third of it, right? I'm taking, and he pays him.
Yeah, it was just kind of a number Adam and his co-founder Miguel McKelvey sort of pulled out of thin air. You know, they kind of threw out a high number. They weren't really looking for a third partner or investor in that way. So they were kind of like, well, we might as well throw out a big number. And if he says yes, then maybe it's worth it. And so, you know, he said yes. And you know, that partnership didn't quite pan out the way any of them planned on it. Joel Schreiber didn't end up coming through with all the money that he had. He ended up not being a full third partner in there. But it was sort of the first example of kind of the way WeWork's valuation could sort of be divorced from the reality of what the business was.
Right.
And you know, how someone could just kind of come in, you know, on a gut feeling and sort of say, okay, yes, that's how much you're worth. And then suddenly that's how much the company's worth.
Right. Okay. So let's move on. Adam starts 2 or 3 buildings. The model's working. He puts this philosophical thing of we as community. It's not real estate anymore. Now he's just morphing this into a technology company, a philosophy, a whole bunch of. He gets these wacky, crazy notions from the Kabbalah Center where he starts going to. He starts getting in touch with the spiritual side and takes off into the stratosphere with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's more or less it. I mean, he you know, the community idea was something that was a part of Adam's life. You know, it was something he sort of believed in. And I think, people will have asked me a lot, like, did he believe kind of some of this and what he was selling in terms of, oh, this is more than a real estate company. We're building a community and all this stuff that people have kind of laughed at. And I think the answer is that, yes, he did believe in that. He did believe that WeWork was building a different kind of office building, a different kind of community than what had existed before. And when you look at those early buildings in New York City and some of the first ones in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, they were really cool. And like people loved working there, especially young workers, especially startups. And there was, it was different. It was not Regus. It was not, the Regus offices, as you know, are perfectly fine and nice, and they have everything you need, and they're pretty boring.
You know what?
And
Let me just, the Regus are like a Ford, the old Fords, and WeWork was like a Tesla. It had a lot of fancy bells and whistles, and you think like, well, it means. Well, I remember walking into Regus when we rented the place, and Regus was great. It was moderate. I had an office. My own, I got to close the door, I got to use the printer, I got the coffee, all that kind of stuff. And but it was basically very, very 1950s. Like it was there. You didn't speak to anyone else. You went to your office, closed your door, and did your work. And then a friend of mine rented his startup in WeWork, and he told me that there was a vibe that was so happening. Those were the words he used. A vibe that was happening, and you got to meet people. There was a lawyer down the hall, and there was another startup 3 doors away from you, and they had a keg of beer on tap. It was just exciting.
Yep. Yeah, and that's in a lot of ways what WeWork was selling. And I think it was a genuine sales pitch. And I think they, it was not the cheapest office you could get. You were paying more for the flexibility, for the month-to-month nature of it, and for all the bells and whistles. And I think early on it was really genuine, and that was something they offered, and the community was real. They didn't have to sort of force it. It was kind of getting people who were like-minded enough that they kind of wanted that kind of office. And where that changed was when the company started to grow, and it's just hard. Building community is a really hard thing, like no matter what kind of business you're in, or not even a business, just like think about how difficult the last year for all of us has been in trying to find new ways to have a community of people when you're in a new situation, and it's just not easy to do. And so as the company grew, as much as they tried, and I think in a lot of ways it was a sincere effort to try to maintain that spirit from those early buildings, it just became impossible when suddenly you have half of a WeWork building going to Microsoft or an insurance company or whatever, who, they're coming to WeWork suddenly to say, we want some of that. We want that vibe that this person's talking about. And it's like, as much as you try, you're kind of going to kill the vibe when you show up that way. And so it just became so much more difficult to build that and to have that thing that was different about WeWork match up to the valuation. The valuation kept growing and growing and growing, sort of on this notion that WeWork was doing something different, and people sort of assumed that because they were doing something different, different enough that it would eventually find ways to make even more money and find ways to justify those numbers.
Okay, so let's hold on to that for 1 second. I think what your book does really well is it goes through a lot of the eccentricities of Rebecca, Adam's wife, and Adam himself. Now, Adam is dyslexic, which makes reading and writing difficult. So he's extremely creative, able to talk fast on his feet, able to have this type of aura, or almost cult-like personality. Just go through a couple some of the wacky things. There were just too many of them in the book. I started jotting them down. That was commonplace among WeWork centers and people and everyone around them. But to the rest of the world, you look at it and say, this is nutty.
Yeah. I mean, the partying was the big one, and it's not like WeWork was alone in being a place where alcohol mixed with work. I mean, anyone who worked in a bank over the last however many decades in New York, those were not quiet places necessarily. The startup world was certainly a place where mixing your life with your work is just the way that it goes, to such a degree that there's almost no difference. And so I think especially early on, there was that blurring of a line between the life that people had outside of WeWork and the life they had at the company. And that could go, especially in the early days, that could even be the people who rented space at WeWork. They got wrapped up in this community, and they got to know some of the employees, and that became their sort of social circle. And certainly for employees, they were working these sort of insanely long hours with Adam's encouragement. He was telling them, we're growing so fast, and we need you to do this. And if you just work with me until midnight every night, eventually you're going to get paid a huge amount of money when we go public. And that was fueled by a lot of young people who came into the company, in some ways very idealistic about the mission of the company, and they believed in it, and they believed in this idea of building community and making the world a better place. And then it was also just an exciting and fun place to work, and WeWork fed into that. They had these late night parties at the office where you'd be having tequila shots while just kind of finishing off your workday with your friends who happen to be your coworkers. And they threw these lavish parties and their big summer camp every year, where they invited all the employees to. So, again, they weren't alone, but in doing that kind of thing, but they were sort of the most extreme example. And Adam was at the heart of that.
Right.
He was the partier in chief. He was encouraging of all this, and he enjoyed it, and he knew the ways in which it could build loyalty and make his employees work even harder.
Right. So they're getting all this partying, this new energy. That energy seems to be spiritual energy floating around the place, and all sorts of nice little buzzwords that they're using. And during this time, Adam is building and leasing more and more buildings. Landlords are going out and signing deals with this guy. They think maybe he does have the magic formula of taking our boring or disrupting rental in real estate, because that was a big thing I remember at the time in 2015, 16, 17, when I was speaking to my friends in real estate. They're saying, no, he's a disruptor. Like Amazon disrupted retail, he's disrupting real estate. I looked at it, I said, I just still can't figure out how he's disrupting anything. He's basically in the same business you guys are in. He's just renting the stuff out and putting a little thing. No, you're not getting it. All right, so I didn't get it. But so anyway, he's going on, and he continually signing leases, and it takes on a snowball type effect. It just can be bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where you write in your book, he's talking to competitors who have small little businesses, and it seemed to be a very profitable niche. And he's telling people, you're either with us, or I'm going to crush you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think probably some of those people you were talking to in the real estate world, their perception of Adam probably changed over time. I think early on, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, we've seen this before. We've seen Regus. We know what that business is. It's fine, but there are problems with it. There's reasons we don't do that." And then there kind of was like a little bit of curiosity. He was starting to take up space. And again, as you mentioned, this was kind of in an era where, there weren't a lot of people taking up whole buildings of New York City office space in the early 2010s, and Adam was willing to do that. And so some landlords were just constitutionally resistant to it, but others sort of had to listen. He was the best option they had. And then once you get to the middle of the decade, Adam suddenly had a ton of money, and he had that from his investors. And in being able to deploy that money, suddenly, if you were a landlord, you kind of had to listen to him, because he was gobbling up so much space that if he didn't take your building, he was going to take the one next door.
Right.
and there was this level of which, like, the company's success sort of beget further success, and people in real estate sort of eventually kind of, many of them came to sort of fear somehow that Adam and WeWork had figured something out, that they had figured out something that made their business different than all the ones that had come before it, not just in the sort of, the fun stuff and the frills, but in the actual core of the business and how they made money. So there was this kind of real fear of that. And real estate's a relatively traditional kind of industry. It's very small groups, often families running these businesses. So I think there was a little bit of fear that this new hot, tech inflected startup with a bunch of money from investors was actually going to find a way to disrupt things.
Okay, so that's Adam 2.A. He's playing the private equity game phenomenally well. He's selling these private equity funds, he's getting capital from them, from some of the biggest, right? From Benchmark. Who else did he get in the beginning there? Benchmark.
Benchmark was the big Silicon Valley investor, and then he ended up getting money from then a lot of the big banks and the big institutions.
Right. So they were throwing money at him. They looked at the same business, and with all their rigor and all their tests and all their rational points of view, they still got sucked into the game, and that's a key thing. So when the ether is being spread around, everyone starts sucking it up and starts believing that you could turn water into wine. So he keeps going with this. He's building up, but he constantly needs more money. Why does he keep needing money? Real estate is a cash cow. Once you get the leases, you sell it, you rent them out for more money, you sublet them out, which basically WeWork's doing. You should be able to self-fund this. Why does he keep going back to the till?
Well, you can make a lot of money, but it costs a lot of money to get off the ground. I mean, that's why it's such a risky endeavor. And taking out these leases required a lot of money. Building out each space was very expensive, and staffing them was expensive as well. And so there were various points at which if WeWork had been willing to grow slower, or kind of stopped growing for a while, they probably would have gotten to a point where they were printing a lot of money. It wouldn't have been an amount of money that would have justified the valuations that the company eventually got to, but it would have been a good business.
It would have been a great business. I think J.P. Morgan was the largest landlord in New York, or largest amount of rental space. I forgot how many millions of square feet they have. And Adam said, I'm going to be bigger than you. And it was silly in the beginning. You had a couple of 100,000 square feet. But at the end of the story, he becomes bigger than J.P. Morgan. How many square feet is that? I forgot the number. You had something in the book.
You're testing me, but it's a huge,
it's in the millions, right?
Millions of square feet in New York City and Manhattan
Amazing.
Alone. And,
right.
And he did it.
Right. Okay, so now things are going. He's raising money. His cult of personality is absolutely amazing. He could say the same thing that everyone else is saying, but says it in such a different way that gets people to believe in him to the point where they have their own lingo. I'm reading this, Reeves, and it sounds to me all the definitions of a cult. They have their own words. They all only congregate among themselves. Their whole family is their coworkers. They live together. They sleep together. They party together. That's all that they know. And every day they get the cult leader coming and telling them, we're going to change the world. And the cult leader's wife comes in there and she tells, and they look around and they see all these other people saying, giving the cult leader a lot of credibility by throwing more money at this guy. So, it's hard to say, it's hard not to get sucked up into this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there were different sort of ways into the cult. If you were an employee, you were inspired by the fact that this was a company that did seem to be making the world better. You were inspired by the promises that one day you were going to cash out these stock options the way people were doing sort of in the startup world. And then, landlords got caught up in the cult of disruption and thinking that they didn't want to get left behind. And then for investors, this was just an era where the types of companies that were pulling in money were companies that were promising to take over an industry.
Right.
This was not a moment where people were looking for nicely profitable businesses.
Right.
They were looking for the next Google, the next Airbnb, the next Uber, these companies that had the ambitions to try to do that. And WeWork was as close as anyone had gotten to attempting to do that to real estate,
Right.
which is of course a huge industry that had been relatively resistant to
change.
sort of
Yeah,
any kind of change. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think, people were willing to look past a lot on the hope that Adam Neumann could figure this out.
Okay. So now he's raising all this money, and now chapter 2, which I think this is part of your story, which if I would title this book, I would title it the rise and fall of Adam Neumann and Masayoshi Son. So before you begin to break this down for us, I just want to get our listeners to know, Masayoshi Son is the founder startup of SoftBank. They raised, $100 billion or so? Is that the right number? Into a fund, a lot of the Saudi money, a lot of the petrodollars that Saudi Arabia saw that was leaving the region, and now they were looking for the new thing, and he was investing. He was throwing around money like a drunken sailor. I mean, just throwing money at things. And as Warren Buffett says, a competitive moat is something which a competitor cannot cross. It's like a moat in a castle where it's so formidable, the defense, that you can't cross over it. That's a great business. And Masa's moat was capital. He was throwing money at these businesses. So he meets, and by the way, I just want to say one thing before I let you just expand on this. He's no fool. He makes an investment that will go down in history as probably the greatest return ever, ever, ever. He puts 20 million, that's with an M, into Alibaba, which is the Google, Amazon, everything of really the Amazon of China. By just looking at Jack Ma, as he says, I looked into his eyes. That's all he did. Looked into his eyes, gave him $20 million or so, wanted to get more, I believe, but Jack Ma said no. And that eventually $20 million turned into $100 billion. Astounding.
Yep.
So Masa believed his own press, and he had the creds to prove it, right? He knew how to find these people. Forget about the zillions of other failures. But he found this. So he needs one great success, and that's it. And I don't think there's a greater one. So Adam and him connect, and then an explosion happens.
Yeah, Masa was someone who looked for big bets, and he had made many big ones. The Alibaba one was the most successful, and his new Vision Fund was his basic latest gambit to raise the largest venture capital fund ever raised in order to fund what he saw as the future of the tech world. And this was investing a lot in companies that were focused on artificial intelligence, was his big sort of thing that he talked a lot about. But the only problem was that there were only so many companies to invest in, and there were only so many companies that could promise the kinds of returns that you would need to get in order to make investing $100 billion make much sense. And so WeWork fit that bill, even though it didn't fit the bill of artificial intelligence being at the core of the business. There, it was could certainly make the argument of being a part of the tech boom and all of that. And the company made some strained efforts to try to present itself as a tech company, but ultimately, it was a real estate play, and if it worked, it could be a gigantic company. But the most optimistic view was just that, and it was almost I think certainly in hindsight a pipe dream to think they could kind of achieve what Masa and Adam set out to do, but they were two people sort of perfectly primed to meet and embrace each other's willingness to just think big.
It's like the stars aligned at that certain moment in time where everything was perfect for these two people to meet, for Adam's idea of WeWork, of $1 trillion market, the whole real estate market in the world, I think is only, I don't know how many billion, hundreds of billions, but they came up with $1 trillion. and some humongous thing. Masayoshi Son had to invest this money in order to get any type of returns. Here's a guy talking in the T's, not the B's. Instead of billions, he's talking in the trillions. And here's a guy with a lot of capital who just made an investment in Uber. All right, he was making some very successful investments, and they were all losing money at the time. But he had not a 5-year outlook, he had a 300-year outlook, which is just amazing. So here you have these two guys feeding off each other, and he gives Adam what, $4 billion or $5 billion?
Yep.
So you just gave an alcoholic the keys to the bar and said, manage it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair analogy, and I think it it was the perfectly wrong thing to happen at that moment. And on the other hand, can you blame Adam Neumann for taking it? Could you blame him for taking $4 billion? It'd be pretty hard for any of us to sit there and turn down a check like that. But I think in hindsight, that amount of money was just too much for the company to handle, and frankly, too much for any company to try to.
But you know what? You bring a good point. You bring a good point, Reeves. I'm sorry to interrupt you on this. You titled the book, right? I think it was let me just get it. The decline. No, what would you call it?
I think we had the rise and fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork.
Okay, it was a fall or something else. I think it was a.
May have been a spectacular fall.
Yeah, maybe that was your PR. Maybe that was your book publisher, right? The epic rise. They probably put that in, right? The epic rise and spectacular fall of Adam Neumann. But yeah. When I read this book and living through this and seeing it, it wasn't only him. He had enablers all around him. You point out J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon. He considered Jamie Dimon his private banker. He had Masai throwing billions of dollars. He had private equity telling him he walked on water. And, at the end of the day, you start, as Ace Greenberg or Bear Stearns used to say, never believe your own flatulence or perfume. But these guys did. They believed that this was the new everything. So Adam Neumann and WeWorks could not have happened the way I see it without all of these enablers. It would have been an idea that would have died at some point or just hit a tipping point where it needed money. But at every step, when he wanted to take it to the next level, there was money finding him.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think Adam was very good at finding that money, but it wasn't all that hard. People wanted to invest in a company like this, and even sometimes against their better judgment, and so this was just a moment I think where he found kind of the perfect sort of environment for his particular skill set to do this.
Right. So Masa needs to employ $100 billion. He's looking for Vision Fund 2, where he's going to raise another $100 billion. Adam's expanding at such a rapid pace. He's signing leases at any building that doesn't move. He's signing a lease for. Any discipline they had goes out the window. They're signing deals that sometimes will never make money, like a creative artist building that Michael Orvitz, he raked them over the coals where he put so many concessions there. WeWork can never make money. They were giving away free rent. They were doing everything possible to attract. And all the time, they're still a private company. All the shenanigans going on still stay within the four walls of the company. And the enablers are there continually throwing cash and, I have to add, taking out money. Right? Benchmark pulled out, 10 times, a 10-fold or 20-fold on their investment?
Yep. Did very well. Yeah, everyone, a lot of the investors except for SoftBank did really well on this. And so, that's the other thing is as they were able to take money out of the company, they didn't have a lot of incentive to kind of slow things down or tell Adam not to take the $4 billion. They were getting paid along the way. And so even if it may not have been in the long-term best interest of the company, people were incentivized to just kind of go along with things.
Right. So now this is going, and all of a sudden it's building up to a fever pace where now they have Masa and Adam come up with Fortitude. What is Fortitude? Project Fortitude. Is a project, or that's their code name for it?
That was the code name, yeah.
Okay.
It essentially was a plan to keep the company private. SoftBank was going to invest somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 billion to be able to buy out pretty much every other investor in the company, basically leaving Masa and Adam in charge. And this was, there were a few reasons for this. I mean, a big one was that the company was running out of money, and they needed more to continue growing at the pace that they wanted to grow.
By the way, Reeves, let me just interrupt you a second. Just to point out, they're losing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, because of all the upfront expenses one has to have to retrofit a building for this. So this is not something that is making money at this point. It's not even something that's breaking even. Even their projections are looking dismal because they are missing them by just 180 degrees. They're just going in the opposite direction of what their projections should say.
Yeah, they were burning cash all over the place, and sometimes on silly stuff, but most of it was just on growing the business and how much was required. And so, this was essentially a plan to avoid going public, and the idea of avoiding going public was basically on the notion that the public market would not understand or be willing to eat the kind of losses that WeWork was having, and which Adam and Masa believed were necessary to try to expand as quickly as they wanted to. So it was a plan to do that. Ultimately, raising that $20 billion and coming up with it to be able to spend it was beyond even Masa's ability to come up with, and it fell apart. And when it did, that basically left the company no choice but to go public.
Right. So Masa is feeding Adam. Adam is saying, I have to keep, if I want to have this torrid growth, I need to keep leasing, because there's only one number that matters in this business. It's basically how many people are leasing space from WeWorks. That's all it is. If you have 1 million square feet of space, you have to lease every one of them, every piece of that, because anything you don't, you're going to be losing. You're on the hook for. So it was a treadmill that, in the way I see it, it just kept getting faster and faster and faster, where it was impossible to even keep up at this pace. There just wasn't enough market. There wasn't enough real estate. There wasn't enough people who needed this, the demand for it. It wasn't, I think you point out something really good with Uber, and the difference was Uber lost billions of dollars. Almost, I don't know how many millions of people used Uber, but only a couple 100,000 people at most used WeWorks. So Uber was pretty ubiquitous. If there was no longer a word cost, service, or taxi, I'm Ubering it. It became a verb.
Yeah, it did. But it was not. Yeah, it never got to that level. And I think there were just points at which they were trying to take out, even trying to find buildings to lease. There were not enough buildings in particular cities for them to meet their goals, and then let alone once you get the buildings, to your point, to actually fill them with enough people to make it work. They just, it was one of these where you can put a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet and you can kind of make it all work, but then the practicalities of it just don't check out.
Right. So Masa is, at this point, Fortitude falls apart. Adam's not getting any more money from him. He's feeling the pressure because he's booking losses on some of his investments. And then they make the decision to go public. And that's the last chapter of this Greek tragedy. When they go public, they file what's is called an S1, which basically is you have to pull down your pants and show Wall Street exactly everything about you before you have public money. Tell us about what that S1 looked like. And it's usually not boring, I shouldn't say boring, I've read many of them, but they're always exciting. They're always good because every company's showing you that's what they have to do before they go public, and they have to tell you how the world is great and how they're going to capture all this TAM, total addressable market. They're going to get the biggest, but WeWork's S1 just goes over, just like everything else in their whole business. It's everything else that everyone else is doing, and square it, or really cube it. It just keeps rolling.
Yeah, I think there were sort of too many blows for WeWork to weather. I mean, there were all there was all the weird kooky stuff that was in there, the kind of kooky slogans that they had, dedicating it to the energy of we, these glitzy photo spreads that kind of just were not typical of these kinds of documents. And then there were also all these conflicts of interest. There were all these problems that existed inside the company, where it was clear that this was Adam's company, and he was sort of enriching himself, even as the company was growing along the way, that led people to look differently. And then on top of that were the losses, were the actual fundamentals of the business. And I think, if any one of those things hadn't been there, it's possible they could have weathered this storm in some way. They were not the only company losing tons of money who've had a successful stock offering. They were not the only company with a founder who controlled the company in this kind of way. And they were not the only weird company to go public. But having all three of those things, I think, was just too much for the public and the kind of investors that invest in IPOs to be willing to get behind.
But not in fairness, but just looking at another point, when you have these type of companies out there, because Tesla, Elon Musk, cult following, haven't made much money, changed the world, go to Mars. In fact, you mentioned that Adam Neumann met with Elon Musk about when Musk does get to Mars, Adam's going to build the communities on Mars. It just boggles my mind. But anyway, put all that aside just for a second. The way I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is all of these, they compounded, they kind of worked with one another. All these variables kept compounding with each other. But I think what the defining moment is when sane people who weren't sucked into who didn't have any part in it, who were looking at it as an outside investment, who weren't, sucking in really any of this laugh and gas, looked and said, he's doing nothing special here. It's nothing. It's a real estate business. I remember Sam Zell, the vulture investor, phenomenally successful investor, knows everything about real estate. He looked and he says, companies have done this before. They don't make money, much money. Regus had a $3 billion valuation. They've been in business for a while. When you were reviewing this, when you saw the S1 and when you started researching the book, do you think that was a wake-up call to all of these? Because you're right, everyone else was losing money at the time. Ubers were losing tons. There was all sorts of problems with culture and wacky people and all these kinds of things. But I'm just thinking this, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert on this, is that I think a lot of people were fooled into believing something that just wasn't so, and this confirmed it.
I think that's right. And I think the only thing I would tweak is to say, I don't know if they believed it, but they hoped it. And a lot of the early investors who had gotten in on this and the people who got behind Adam, they knew all the issues. It's not necessarily like they were totally confident that Adam was going to be able to figure this out, but they hoped that he would. And they hoped that he would, because if he did, it would make everyone so unfathomably rich that it was worth the risk for a lot of these people. But once you get to the stock market and an IPO, the people investing there are investing people's pension funds and mutual funds and those kinds of things. And those investors, they've become much more interested and willing to take these kind of bigger bets, but they also are generally just constitutionally more conservative. And so I think that, it was just a different group of people who Adam was having to now talk to and pitch to. And
right.
Those people, they don't work on hope. They work on belief, and they work on numbers, and that wasn't what WeWork was able to sell.
Right. I think which was so amazing at the end when this IPO blows up in terms, it's a slap in the face. Adam can't figure it out, that the street just turns against him. Everyone looks at him as that. At the end of the day, it was just a real estate company, no matter how many bells and whistles. But I think the key was no one could really explain what the business did. I think you put that in your book. I remember seeing that, something where you couldn't sum up to an outside person what WeWorks was.
Yeah. And I think you could, but it wasn't, it wasn't what they were selling. And And the simple description of what they did is they leased out nicely designed office space with flexible terms, and that was it. And at the end of the day, that's a fine business, but it's not a $47 billion business. And WeWork wasn't willing to be okay with just fine.
Right. So let's just cut to the chase. Story's over. Last chapter of this book is the IPO. Adam's told by, I believe it was J.P. Morgan and Masa and Goldman, I think, everyone was in that this is not going to fly. There's no way we can sell this. The valuation kept getting chopped down even lower, even lower, even lower, till they have to just say, game over. And when that happens, take us to the next point.
When that happens, game over is Adam Neumann can't be the CEO of this company anymore. And that was kind of what everyone realized, was that all the problems were tied up with him, and that the company needed to go public at some point. The company needed more money, and that just Adam's name and everything that he was wrapped up in with the company was going to prevent it from doing so. And so, he was ousted in kind of a coup staged by the people who had been his chief backers, and SoftBank poured even more money into the business to try to float it, and that's sort of where the story is a year and a half later. In a certain respect, is Adam is gone. SoftBank agreed to float the company for a while, but even their money won't keep it solvent forever. A pandemic happened, which no one can blame Adam Neumann for, but that didn't help WeWork's business, and now they're trying to figure out what is the path forward, and they are already talking about an IPO later this year, and potentially trying to do this yet again. And I think it'll certainly be really interesting to try to kind of see how they try to pitch this the second time around.
Right. So when Adam leaves, he gets an amazing exit package. His loan of $500 gets a loan. I think it's $500 million or so.
Yep.
Yeah. $500 million gets forgiven, or he gets loaned that money.
Yeah, he got a loan. He was allowed to sort of cover an existing $500 million line of credit that he already had, and that was tied to the value of his stock. And so, potentially he could have theoretically been insolvent. SoftBank basically bailed him out and agreed to buy a significant amount of stock from him. Initially, it was supposed to be about $1 billion. That number's been cut in half roughly. And he also got a consulting fee, $185 million to not start another company and I guess be around if anyone had any questions for him.
This reminds me of after the financial crisis, the people who got us there with the marks and creating all these CDSs and CMOs, they were the ones who still got a consulting fee because they were the only ones who knew how these things worked. That blew up the whole system. So it's it's.
I know.
Absolutely.
The people responsible who don't get caught up in it, and in this case, the people who faced real consequences were the employees. Employees who put their faith in this company and had been told they were going to get rich. And you can say they were naive about it, but I'd place the blame on the people who were telling them that more than I would the people who were doing the work.
Yeah. And the last word, Reeves, what lessons could one learn in terms of just running a business, being an entrepreneur, or even not being an entrepreneur, just being an investor? What lessons would you say pop out at you after seeing this from start to end? You had amazing access to Adam. This is your first book, right?
Correct, yeah.
The amount of research, and you were at the New Yorker, and you guys are notorious for being fact checkers of fact checkers. So you really immersed yourself into this. So I don't think there's a better guy to ask as to what lessons can be drawn from this fiasco.
Yeah, I think I've thought a good amount about this, and I think that the main thing that I would say is that, going back to something you pointed out, was this moment where Adam got this $4 billion check from Masa is the moment when everything went off the rails, and at the time it was the moment where everyone thought it was going to the moon, and so in my sense, I think the lesson I would take is not that, from that point on, Adam Neumann was just partying all the time and flying on private jets and smoking pot, and that was the problem. All those things were true, but I don't think that is what caused the downfall. And I also think that in many ways, some of the other criticisms of the company didn't cause it. What caused it to me was, there is no way for any company to grow as fast as WeWork was trying to go, to spend as much money as SoftBank had given it in any kind of responsible way. You can't do those things at once. And I've written about other startups that haven't gotten checks that big, but have gotten checks that they couldn't handle. And the moment they get them is when everything runs off the rails. And so I do think that, both for founders who are raising money and for investors who are giving money, I think you need to think really hard about whether you're giving someone too much, whether the ambitions you have for a company are actually in line with what they can achieve, and whether the amount of money you're giving them is going to enable them to do that, or in some ways only sort of enable irresponsibility.
Destroy them.
That's a really tricky line to hit, but I think that it's one that people really need to spend time thinking about.
Yeah, great lesson. Warren Buffett always said that an empty wallet makes for a good investor. When you have too much money, you start getting really sloppy. But when you have to borrow from your credit card, and you have to make a payment each month, you become really sharp. You watch those nickels and dimes. And when you get so much money in, you just get blind and you just see one side, and that's just the revenue growth. And you forget about everything else. But Reeves, I want to tell you, man, continued success. I hope you come out with another book sometime in the near future. I want to tell you, this book read like a novel. Go flipping through my Kindle, and I read it over the weekend. I started Friday afternoon, and I finished it literally on the train this morning. And I just kept going one after that. I said, wow, this is your writing style is not only good, it's the cadence, the pace. Soon as you have a story that seems to be dying out, you pick up another thread, and that pace starts to pick up. So Adam Neumann lands, here's what Rebecca's doing. That happens back at corporate headquarters. And I had to breathe at times. Like, whoa, you're throwing a lot. Really, it's a real great talent, man. You sucked me in. You did really well. The name of the book is $1 Billion Loser, The Epic Rise and Spectacular Fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork. Go out, get a copy, get a Kindle copy, do whatever you need to do. Read the book, because there are so many great lessons in there. And it really goes to show that investors need to just ask one question: how much? And if you can't figure out the valuation of something, I don't care what anyone says or how much money is being thrown in and what kind of seal of approvals they're getting. Doesn't matter. You just got to have a council of one, and that's yourself, and just be a little smarter than the next guy and say, I'm not smoking any stuff, because it just doesn't make sense. And I remember there were many great investors at the time saying, this is a joke. I remember Sam Zell being one of them. I don't want to say I was a great investor, but I'm just looking at this, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Taking real estate, carving it up, I got it. To be worth $47 billion, I just don't get it. Reeves Wiedeman, thanks so much for being on the show, man. I really enjoyed it, and all the success and good fortune to you.
Thank you for having me, Charles.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.